Hello, everyone, and depending on where you may be, good morning, good day, or good evening. Welcome to this webinar during which we would like to introduce to you the seventh call of the NAMA facility. My name is Gunnar Wegner. I work at the technical support unit of the NAMA facility, and together with two colleagues who you'll meet in a minute, I'll guide you through this presentation. So first of all, we'd like to thank you for your interest in the seventh call of the NAMA facility. By the latest count, I think we have about 180 participants in this webinar, and we're really happy to see this huge turnout. Our goals for this webinar for today are threefold. We'd like to start with a very short introduction of the NAMA facility, and we want to spend some time explaining the seventh call process. Then we also want to share with you some lessons learned and common challenges that applicants are facing when developing outlines. And we hope that this will give you valuable insights for your own outline design. And lastly, throughout the presentation, we will point you to a number of resources which we recommend you consult during outline development. Before we dive into the presentation, we wanted to share two additional things. The first is that today we will be giving you a lot of information, but we will not be giving you all the information. There are many topics that we will touch upon, but for a full understanding, you will need to refer to some of the resources that we mentioned. The second thing is that in the past, we had included a very detailed walkthrough of all the application documents in the webinar, in the introduction to the sixth call, for example. However, in this, today we will not be doing this. And if you are interested in a detailed walkthrough of all the application documents, we'd like to refer you to this video, which is on our website. Okay, then with this, let's begin by presenting ourselves. So here we have the team that will guide you through this webinar. We all work at the technical support unit of the NAMA facility. The TSU acts as the secretariat of the NAMA facility, and we are all based in Berlin, in Germany. As you can see from the screenshots, we are doing this partly from the home office. So we'd like to especially ask you for patience if there are any technical problems. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Dalia for some technical information.
Thank you, Gunnar, and hello, everyone. Before we dive into the content of this webinar, let me give a quick introduction into the technical features. First, you can hide the control panel using this button here. Second, you can view the webinar in full screen using this button. And third, you can adjust the language of the control panel using this globe icon. There's also a question tab where you can submit any question you may have during the session. To do so, just open the question tab and type your questions in the window. We, the webinar hosts, will be the only ones who can see it. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session, so please submit them beforehand. If there are more questions than we can answer today, we will answer those questions after the webinar and publish them on our website. Moreover, this webinar is going to be recorded and uploaded in our website, so you can also revisit it at a later stage. Let me now pass the microphone to Gunnar for an overview of today's agenda.
Okay, thank you, Dalia. Yeah, the structure of this webinar is the introduction to the NAMA facility, then the seventh call process, timeline, and resources. And then we'll have a short question and answer session. So please let us know your questions so that we can take them up. In the third section, we will talk about the application documents. And yeah, I think with this, we can begin and jump into the first section of this webinar. Let's start by explaining who we are. The NAMA facility is a multi-donor fund with contributions from Germany, the UK, Denmark, and the European Union. The NAMA facility was created in 2013. We operate through annual calls for NAMA support projects. This is our seventh call, and we've been in operation for 7 years now. The calls are competitive, and only the best projects are selected. Of course, later in this webinar, we'll give you an overview of who can participate in the calls and how we will assess your submissions. So far, the donors have contributed a bit more than €500 million to the NAMA facility. And our portfolio at this time consists of 29 NAMA support projects in 23 countries. There are some countries that have 2 or even 3 projects. You can see the world map here with our projects. And we'd like to invite you to visit our website for more details on our pipeline and our current portfolio. The NAMA facility does not focus on any specific region or any specific sector. And that's why we noted it here. We have a broad range of sectors such as transport, energy efficiency, renewable energy. We've recently added a forestry project. Also, we have projects in the waste sector and also in the agriculture sector. So now on the next slide, I'd like to give you a short overview of the characteristics of our NAMA support projects. Let's start at the left. NAMA support projects must be implementation ready. By this, we mean that the financial mechanism must be operational within 18 months of the decision of the NAMA Facility Board to approve the NSP. 18 months may sound long, but this is from experience, we know that this is a huge challenge, and we'd like you to address this in your outline. Another important item is that NAMA support projects must trigger transformational change. We have a detailed description of what we understand by transformational change on our website, but just very briefly, transformational change works on the entire system. It is catalytic, it is fast, and it also involves behavior change. Moving to the next box, NAMA support projects integrate with existing sector-wide policies. We know that not all countries have NAMAs, and therefore it is sufficient for us that a NAMA support project is embedded into national policy as long as these national policies contain a specific reference to an NDC. Another important feature of NAMA support projects is that they combine elements of technical cooperation and financial cooperation. So the TC component will typically work on policy reform and regulation. This is where a NAMA support project contributes, for example, to an enabling environment and to behavior change. And then the FC component must set up a financial mechanism that channels funds to investment for carbon neutral development, that reduces or removes barriers, and that leverages additional funds. And we will go into more detail on the financial mechanisms on the later slide. And lastly, another characteristic of NAMA support projects is that they are projects, they are temporary, and they end. So therefore, each NAMA support projects must have a phase-out strategy to ensure long-term sustainability. And this concludes the first section of this webinar. And I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Radina, for an overview of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar, and hello everyone from my side as well. So, as we have all seen, and probably the reason why most of you are here, the 7th call for outlines launched on April 1st, and this was no April Fool's joke. The NAMA facility donors renewed their commitment to the NAMA facility, and the UK and Germany intend to commit up to 60 million euros in additional funding for the implementation of the 7th call. In addition, the UK has also announced additional funding in the volume of up to 38 million euros to support projects from past and future calls. The NAMA facility donors joined others from across the climate community and raised its ambition by shifting the approach from low carbon to carbon neutral development and pathways. This shift reflects an increased push to limit global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees Celsius. With this, the NAMA facility works towards carbon neutrality at the portfolio level. Potential applicants to the NAMA facility call should note that carbon neutrality, while viewed favorably, is not a prerequisite for the development and submission of successful NSP outlines. The NAMA facility remains open to supporting climate mitigation actions across all sectors in a wide range of fields, including those where a low carbon approach rather than carbon neutral is the most feasible way to achieve ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reductions. To read more about this and the NAMA facility donor strategies, you can follow the link on this slide. So with this, all ODA eligible countries are invited to submit NAMA support projects in the 7th call. And as in previous calls, the selection will be based on ambition and feasibility. And as Gunnar already explained, the call is open to all sectors. There's also good news for those who have been following the NAMA facility for some time now. In the 7th call, there are only limited changes in the process and documents compared to the 6th call, and we will flag these to you
throughout the upcoming parts of this webinar. First, before we go into the details, I would like to draw your attention to the general information document. This document is the central source of information for the 7th call. Its purpose is to assist applicants in preparing and submitting NAMA support project outlines. It describes the project cycle in detail, as well as the assessment process. We also have courtesy translations in Spanish and French. In today's webinar, we will emphasize some selected points of the GID. However, we strongly encourage you to read the entire document for yourselves. So, moving on, let's take a look at the overall process and timeline of the 7th call of the NAMA facility. First, I would like to say that the NAMA facility is closely monitoring the effects of COVID and its spread around the world, but for the moment, the 7th call is proceeding according to schedule. So, with this, the arrow indicates where we are, just after the launch. After the numerous feedback we have received in the 6th call, we have extended the call to include 5 months in order to give applicants more time to develop their NSP outlines. The call is open now and will close on September 1st at 3 p.m. Central European Summer Time. While the call is open, applicants are invited to raise any questions they might have, and we, the Technical Support Unit, will provide applicants with the necessary support. We will also conduct 2 more webinars, and I will elaborate on these and provide you with more details shortly. After the deadline of outline submissions, the NSP outlines are reviewed independently by the Technical Support Unit, the TSU, and an external assessor team. Dalia will introduce us to the assessment criteria that we use shortly. After this initial desk assessment, a first short list of projects is decided by the NAMA Facility Board. The shortlisted outlines undergo an in-depth assessment, which may include a written round of clarifications and potentially an on-site visit. Based on the assessment results, the donors of the NAMA facility will decide on which projects can proceed and go into what we call the detailed preparation phase, or DPP. Applicants will be notified on this decision, and selected projects will be invited to further detail their NAMA support projects. The DPP is about refining and improving project design with the ultimate purpose of preparing a comprehensive and detailed proposal for NSP implementation. The NAMA facility provides financial support for this phase, and for which at the start of the DPP, a grant agreement would be concluded. The DPP has a total duration of up to 15 months from signing the grant agreement, and the final proposal can be submitted to the NAMA facility either at the end of 10 or 15 months. Please note that the donor's decision to provide funding for the DPP does not mean that the project automatically receives funding also for implementation. The second approval phase commences with the submission of an NSP proposal. The NSP proposal undergoes a detailed assessment, and only the proposals that successfully pass this assessment and show sufficient quality are then recommended to the board. Implementation is the final stage of the NAMA facility process and marks the main phase of the NSP slide. Here, we have also included a new feature, a phased approach to NSP implementation. We're not going to touch upon the details today, but you can read more about this in our GID. During the implementation phase, the close interaction between the TSU and the NSP continues. The NAMA facility strives to be a learning hub, and we want to build on the experiences of financing and implementing NAMAs and share these lessons with the global climate community. So, a key question that you might have, and a recurring question that we receive often is that we would like to cover with you today is who can actually submit an outline to the NAMA facility throughout the different phases that I just covered. So this chart that you see on this slide clarifies who does what and when during the different phases that I just described. First, there are no substantial changes regarding who can submit an NSP outline. What we have done is we have elaborated the list of specific eligibility criteria and requirements that the designated entities for the different phases must fulfill. Now, let's look at the outline phase on the left. The applicant who submits an outline to the NAMO facility can be either a national ministry or a legal entity. If the applicant is a national ministry, this should be or must be the ministry responsible for climate change negotiations or the national ministry in charge of the sector targeted by the outline. In this case, which is the first one here on the slide, the national ministry must also identify a qualified legal entity, which is then to become what we call the applicant support partner for contracting for the DPP. The legal entity is required because the NAMO facility cannot directly channel its funding to a national ministry. In the second case, if the applicant is the legal entity itself, it must comply with the capacity requirements and receive endorsements by the national government institutions relevant for the project implementation I just listed. Examples of legal entities that could be eligible include national, regional, or international development banks, UN agencies, NGOs, foundations, development agencies, public utilities, public think tanks with a nonprofit status, among others. But if one legal entity cannot fulfill all the capacity requirements listed in the GID, it may also consider forming a consortium with another entity or even several entities. In this case, a lead partner should be identified and the roles of the partners in the consortium should be clearly delineated. To summarize, outlines can be submitted by a national ministry together with an applicant support partner or by a qualified legal entity alone or in a consortium. Now, let us look at the DPP proposal phase briefly. When a project is selected for DPP, the legal entity that submitted the outline or acted as the applicant support partner will become the contracting partner of the NAMO facility and will receive funding to support the elaboration of a detailed proposal. This legal entity will work closely with the relevant national ministry and key implementing partners in the country to develop the NSP proposal. The legal entity foreseen to become the contracting partner for the implementation of the NSP is called the NAMO Support Organization, or NSO. The NSO is actually the one who will submit the final proposal to the NAMO facility. In many cases, the legal entity acting as the applicant support partner also becomes the NSO. As with applicant support partners, the NSO must also fulfill a set of eligibility criteria that are outlined in our GID. This leads us to the implementation phase. As I just mentioned, the NSO or NAMO support organization will become the contracting partner for the project implementation if the proposal is approved by the NAMO facility donors. We're talking about a significant funding volume in the range of 5 to 20 million euros granted from the NAMO facility. So we apply more demanding capacity requirements for the NSO. Here I'd like to stress that the NAMO facility does not disqualify any outline submissions in the first phase for not proposing an NSO or proposing a non-eligible NSO. In these cases, a suitable NSO can still be identified during the first 3 months of the DPP. Now, I'd like to give the word on to Dalia, who will briefly walk us through the assessment process of the NSP outline.
Thank you, Radina. So I will highlight here the certain key aspects of the assessment criteria. So once we receive the outline, we apply a two-stage assessment process, as you can see on the slide. The first step is an eligibility check, which has mainly formal criteria, such as the timely submission of the outline. The documents must be completed and should only be in English. The funding volume for implementation should be between 5 to 20 million euros. There's also a time limitation for the DPP phase and the implementation. The DPP duration should either be for 10 or 15 months, whereas the implementation duration should be between 3 to 5.5 years. The country must be eligible for official development assistance. And lastly, the NSPs are not eligible for funding if they cannot demonstrate their additionality to previous, ongoing, or planned public and private interventions. Please note that the non-eligibility may lead to the outline not being taken further into the assessment. In the past, we had many outlines who didn't pass the eligibility check. However, in the last call, that wasn't really a problem as all the applicants were eligible. The second step is an outline assessment where we apply two equally weighted assessment criteria, that is ambition and feasibility. Both criteria are scored with a maximum of 25 points and are composed of a number of sub-criteria. As you can see on the slide, each sub-criteria has points, and these points represent the importance that we attach to the different criteria. The first sub-criteria is a potential for transformational change, which is our most important ambition criteria. Our interpretation of it includes a catalytic shift that enables a catalytic shift, meaning a significant change of technology or behavior that enables actors to shift to carbon neutral pathway. The second ambition criterion is financial ambition. The NAMA facilities funds are limited and can only make a small contribution towards a sector transformation. Therefore, we would like to see a high leverage of public and private funds from NAMA facilities contribution. Turning to the third ambition point, we would like to emphasize that greenhouse gas mitigation potential is very important to the NAMA facility. We do not only look for absolute level emission reduction, but at the overall mitigation potential of the country and the respective sector. Under the feasibility criterion, we critically assess readiness of the proposed outline for implementation. The first sub-criteria is a project rationale. The most important factors here are sound and plausible barrier analysis and explanation how the proposed project tackles those. In addition, we attach special importance to the risk analysis, including mitigation measures and the indicators that allow us to verify that the project is on track and if it's likely that the ambitious goals will be reached. Our second feasibility sub-criterion is the NSP design, which has the most marks accorded to it. This should address how exactly the NSP, including the regulatory measure, financial mechanism, technology shift, and capacity building plan to tackle the key barrier and achieve the transformational change in the sector. The most important aspects include feasible technology, plausible business models, and an appropriate institutional setup. Okay, the last feasibility criterion is a DPP concept. What we want to see is that the applicant has a clear understanding of the detailed activities for further project preparation. For a comprehensive list of details, please refer to the webinar from last year where we have covered each criteria in extensive detail. And now back to you, Radina.
Thanks, Dalia. Now let's take a look at the clarification and FAQ series. While the call is open, i.e. until the end of August, the Technical Support Unit will collect questions regarding the 7th call and publish these in what we call clarification notes on our website. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to submit your questions, to submit them to our contact email. We'll publish clarification notes every 6 weeks. With the launch of the call on April 1st, we already published our most frequently asked questions, and all questions raised today will also be included in the round of clarification notes to be published in 2 weeks. The TSU will provide clarifications on the interpretation of the GID and application documents, but we will not provide any NSP-specific advice, such as an individual NSP concept or a proposed partner structure. We do this in order to ensure a transparent and fair competitive call. The TSU will also hold 2 more webinars, one featuring case studies and examples to take place in May next month, and one on our most frequently asked questions and clarifications in July. The registration links will be published on our website accordingly. Now, Dalia, could you tell us a bit more about what's available on the website?
Yeah, sure. So I would like to highlight that the NAMA facility website has a wealth of information available. As we cannot cover all the details in this webinar, we highly encourage you to check the available resources in the NAMA facility website. As you can see on the slide, there is a webinar on the introduction to the sixth call, as well as lessons learned from the sixth call and previous calls as well. We also have other webinars that dive deep into certain topics such as financial mechanism. Beside webinar, we also have mini document and publication that provide details on key topics such as sustainable development co-benefits in the NAMA facility, monitoring and evaluation framework, working document for NSP's potential for transformational change, and answers to frequently asked questions. And now back to you, Dina, again.
I think it's me who's next. Thank you, Dalia.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay. We'd like to spend some minutes now on some of the lessons learned from the sixth call, and we hope that these will be valuable for you. So let's start by sharing, start on the left here, start by sharing some interesting observations that we made. And number one is that we received some outlines that were pushed by cities. Now, NAMA is a nationally appropriate mitigation action, and therefore, of course, the outline has to be embedded within national policies and it has to be endorsed by the relevant national ministries. But what this showed to us is that city governments and even, for example, regional governments can also be important drivers of change. And we think even more generally, this shows the many different participants which are possible within the NAMA support projects. And we were quite happy to see this diversity. Our second observation is that some outlines placed a heavy emphasis on behavior change. This is important because investment is not the only possible driver of transformational change. And indeed, we included behavior change in the NAMA facilities working definition of transformational change in 2019. You can find this working definition on our website, and there was also a link to it on the previous slide with the resources. Okay, let's continue on the right-hand side by sharing some insight into features that we've seen in outlines and that contribute to a positive assessment. The first is acknowledgement of uncertainty. We appreciate outlines in which applicants clearly point out which pieces of information are still missing or still unreliable. We don't expect applicants to have all the answers, but missing information can be obtained during the detailed preparation phase. Therefore, our advice is to be clear about what the missing pieces of information are and how and when they will be obtained. The second item is that an outline has to strike a balance between being ambitious and being realistic. So some outlines are extremely ambitious, yet it is hard to believe that their goals will be achieved. On the other hand, there are outlines where it's quite clear that the goals could be achieved, but the ambition is lacking. So our advice is to find the right balance between ambitiousness and realism. And third, I mentioned this before, an NSP will only exist for some years, whereas we expect that the change that's triggered by the NSP will last much longer. So we need to understand your ideas about how the NSP is phased out. And some of the guiding questions may be, who will drive the change after the end of the NSP? Who takes responsibility? And how will funding be made available after the end of the NSP? Okay, let's go to the next slide and look at some information on the financial mechanisms. Financial mechanisms, in our experience, appear to be the #1 challenge for applicants. And we'd like to urge you to very carefully develop your financial mechanism. In the box on the left, we have two very important questions that you should consider in the design of your financial mechanism. The first is, how does the financial mechanism reduce or even completely remove barriers? And the second question is, how does the financial mechanism leverage additional funds? Now let's continue on the right side by looking at some of the typical weaknesses of financial mechanism that we've seen. The first is that the link between the financial mechanism and the barrier analysis is often too weak. Sometimes the barrier analysis identifies one set of challenges, whereas the financial mechanism addresses an entirely different set of challenges. So make sure that your financial mechanism really targets the barriers which the sector is facing. The second point is that a financial mechanism is sometimes presented without exploring alternatives. This is a weakness because we do not want just some financial mechanism, but the best financial mechanism. So applicants need to explain which alternatives they considered and why they chose the specific financial mechanism that they actually present in the outline. The third one may appear to be quite obvious, but it brings us back to the phase-out strategy. A financial mechanism that only reduces or removes a barrier while the NSP is running is not a good financial mechanism. And we'll have an example of that on the next slide. So our advice is don't work around barriers, but remove them. The fourth is about investment grants. Investment grants are a valid financial mechanism, but they are not very attractive. Often in an investment grant, in full investment grant, for example, there's no additional leverage of funds, and it is difficult to argue that an investment grant really removes barriers. So try to develop more powerful financial mechanisms than simple investment grants. And the last one we'd like to mention it, we've seen this in a number of outlines. When we say financial mechanism, we do not mean just a simple description of how NAMA facility funds will be spent. I hope we made it clear that what we are looking for is here on the left, a description of how investment barriers will be removed and how additional funds will be leveraged. Let me finish this by pointing out additional resources here on the top, on the bottom right. You see a link to a fact sheet on financial mechanisms, and we also have a webinar that was also linked on the resources slide before. Okay, now let's make all of this a bit more lively by looking at an example of what we think is poor NSP design. So on this slide, we try to condense some of our experience into an example of poor design. This example is completely fictitious. It uses the energy efficiency sector, but we are convinced that the lessons that we can learn here apply to outlines from all sectors. So let's look at the main idea of what this NSP wants to do. It wants to launch a national program to exchange inefficient air conditioning units for more efficient ones. And the NAMA facility funds are used as a grant to compensate for the higher cost of the more efficient AC units. So first of all, we'd like to state that, of course, this is a valid approach. Yeah? So this would reduce a massive reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and it would lead to change. But it would still be a poor fit for the NAMA facility. And the question is why? And we've noted three weaknesses or three challenges here. The first weakness is this appears to be a one-time effort. The sector will be taken from its baseline level with the inefficient air conditioning units to an improved level with the efficient air conditioning units. But then the question is, does anything happen after that? In this example, the sector would remain at this improved level, which is good, but it's not enough. So imagine the situation in 5 years from now, at the end of the NSP, the AC units which were introduced during the NSP would be operational, but on the market, there will be even more efficient AC units. And the question that this outline should answer is, how will these more efficient AC units that will be available in the future, how would these get installed? How would these penetrate the market? So the point here that we're trying to make here is that there should be continuous improvement and not a one-time improvement. The second barrier is, or the second weakness is that this NSP appears to be working around the barrier. The higher investment costs will not be a barrier, of course, while the NSP is existing. There's the investment grant. But then again, what happens at the end of the NSP? If nothing else changes, then of course, in 5 years from now, the more efficient units will still be more expensive than the less efficient units. So in this example, the barrier is only lifted for the duration of the NSP, and then it comes back. But what we are looking for, like I said before, is barrier removal. And the third weakness is that we have the full investment grants for the additional cost of the more efficient units. So again, this financial mechanism will be operational as long as the funds are available. And once the funds are depleted, the financial mechanism will stop. There are two problems here. The first is there's no additional leverage of funds. It's only NAMA facility funds. And the second is, among the many possible financial mechanisms, the full investment grant delivers the least output per amount of money spent. And as a simple thought experiment, let's just assume the applicant suggests a partial investment grant instead of a full investment grant, where half the costs are borne by the financial mechanism and the other half by the users. Then we would have a leverage of 1-to-1. This would double the number of units that can be implemented in this project. And the challenge, we think, is to find a financial mechanism that would do maybe 5 times as many units or 10 times as many units. And an investment grant is probably not that financial mechanism. Okay, I think this was a short overview of some of our lessons learned, and we now have our first Q&A session. I think that we've received a ton of questions already. Dalia, which question did you select for us?
You're right, Gunnar. We have actually received a number of questions while we have been talking. So the first set of questions are, can a ministry or an entity submit more than one application or be involved in more than one NSP outline submission? Who would like to take this?
I can take that, Rodina. Yeah, that's a very good question. And the answer is no, there's no limit. Ministries or legal entities could be involved in more than one NSP outline submission, and we have seen this in the past.
And the second question says, are the chances higher to get support if a German or a British organization is going to be the NSO of the project? Can you answer the question?
Yeah, sure. No, this does not play a role. What is important here is that the applicant fulfills the requirements as outlined in the GID. You will see that we have a growing number of new institutions acting as applicant support partners on NSOs in our portfolio, such as KD, an international research and education organization, which was selected in the last call. And we have regional development banks such as EBRD and IDB, which are also acting as applicant support partners or NSOs.
Okay. Can I resubmit a project from an old call which was not selected? Maybe Gunnar, you can take it.
Yeah, you can. You can resubmit a project that was submitted before, and we'd actually like to encourage you to do that. As an information, you may know that we provide feedback calls to all outline submitters whose outlines did not make it into the detailed preparation phase. And when we assess the outlines, we actually go back to the feedback that we had given, and we look if or in what way it was addressed by the applicants. Yeah, so please do resubmit outlines that you submitted before.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the first question says, do you support projects that focus on climate adaptation projects? Maybe you, Radina, you can take this.
I'm sorry, which question did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. You're asking whether climate mitigation, whether climate adaptation projects could be supported from the NAMA facility. Well, the NAMA facility's focus is mitigation actions. Therefore, the focus should be on mitigation and not adaptation or resilience. So, but however, adaptation measures could be a relevant co-benefit and as such could be considered a driver for transformational change. So it's up to applicant to.
Okay, let me, I have two more questions that I see here in the question window. One question is, can a development bank be a legal entity? Yeah, the question is yes. The answer is yes. Like Radina said, we have, for example, IDB, we have national development banks also who acted as applicant support partners before. And another question is, can I submit a project in the forestry sector in Mozambique in coordination with the relevant government ministry? Yes, of course you can.
And I think we're experiencing some technical issues here. Let me make sure we have the presentation.
Oh.
Okay, looks like we're back online.
Okay, Q&A. Yeah, so we're improvising. I think we can go on from now. We will have another Q&A section later. Let's see who's next.
Looks like that's me. I would like to take over now and walk our applicants and listeners through the application documents. Make sure it's loading. Good. So these are the application documents for submission to the NAMA facility as part of the outline phase. What we have here is we have on one side the NSP template and on the other side the required annexes. Now, it's important to note here that along with the GID, the General Information Document, the outline template and accompanying documents have undergone some revision for the 7th call. And I will flag these along. On one side, the outline template has an even lighter structure than last call, which I will elaborate on in a second. Nonetheless, the NAMA facility's expectations involve the readiness and ambition of projects, as Dalia just elaborated, remain high. Also, we still suggest that a completed NSP outline should total no more than 10,000 words or be roughly about 20 pages, excluding the annexes. So now let's take a look at the mandatory annexes. In a change from last year's call, there are now 6 and not 7 mandatory annexes that you have to submit together with the NSP outline. Let's briefly examine which they are. Annex 1 are the endorsement letters from the national ministries. One from the relevant national ministry in charge of climate change negotiations, and one from the ministry of the relevant sector. These letters help us understand the level of political and possibly also financial commitment of the national political partners. The content of these letters is carefully studied and considered during the assessment of the NSP outlines. When you look at the document itself, you will see the content and questions that need to be addressed as part of the letters. Annex 2 is the Logframe, which is the planning instrument for project development. And Gunnar will delve into it in a bit more detail shortly, as many applicants still struggle to depict their project ideas adequately. The third annex serves the purpose to provide information and references regarding the legal entity, which is to become the contracting partner for the detailed preparation phase. In Annex 4, applicants are asked to describe their DPP concept and activity plan and provide a detailed DPP budget. Annex 5 is on the business model and the financial mechanism, which I will also cover in more details shortly. And last but not least is Annex 6, the greenhouse gas mitigation potential. This annex has undergone extensive revision, on one side to provide further clarity and guidance to the applicants, as well as to offer a more consistent presentation of the mitigation potential, and Gunnar will provide us with more guidance here too. So, looking at the outline template that I just mentioned, there are only slight changes. First, applicants are now asked to describe what their projects want to do in one single sentence. Also in one sentence, applicants are also asked to describe what will have changed through the NSP at the end of its implementation. We've included sample examples, and we've added these questions in the place of the abstract in order to, on one side, better understand what projects aim to do, but also to urge applicants to think about this first and offer a clear summary of their approach. As you go through the template itself, you will see that we have added more guiding questions as well as guiding topics for each section of the template. They're presented in a way that supports the applicant in developing a well-detailed project description. Please review these closely and try to address these as you elaborate your NSP outlines. These are also the questions we are going to ask ourselves later as we read your outlines. So, we've summarized here what features a well-written outline have in common. First, they offer a clear picture of how the proposed intervention overcomes the identified barriers. The outline template is a central piece of the submission, and a well-written outline is well-structured, describes the relevant points using the guide questions, and elaborates the details and not just repeats them in the annexes. It's important to think about quality and not quantity of pages written, and where possible to include figures and graphs to support your arguments. Gunnar, I would like to hand over to you to tell us more about Annex 2.
Okay, thank you, Radina. Annex 2 is the Logframe. I actually just wanted to have some brief words on the Logframe here. There appeared to have been some confusion in the past on the indicators. So this year we made it very clear that there are two types of indicators which every applicant has to supply or has to include in their outline. All applicants have to all applications have to always include the NAMA facility core indicators. These core indicators are defined in our M&E framework, and the document is linked here. You'll find it on our website, and we suggest that you carefully study it. And then on top of these core indicators, which are valid for all the NSPs across our entire portfolio, of course, each NSP should have its own specific indicators, for example, sector-specific indicators. Yeah? Just make sure that both are covered. And yeah, some comments on log frames in general. In some cases, the log frames we received were not detailed, or some sections were even left empty. Please don't do that. Some characteristics of good log frames are a good log frame identifies all the assumptions and risks for achieving the outcomes, and impacts. A good log frame is consistent with the outline template. There should not be any contradictions. The log frame does not have to contain all the information, but it should provide a high-level and complete overview of the NAMA support project that you intend to implement. And please also include an overview of the proposed activity. You'll see all of these sections in the log frame template. And if you follow the template, you should be doing fine. Yeah? Okay, I think Radina will tell us something about the business model on the next slide.
Yes, thank you, Gunnar. So let us take a look at Annex 5, which is one of the most challenging ones from the application documents from our experience from the previous calls. In this annex, the connection between the project's business model and the features of the financial mechanisms are delineated in 3 sections, 2 mandatory and 1 optional one. This annex is central and helps us to better understand what is the business as usual scenario of the proposed intervention, what makes a targeted technology or technologies the right choice for investment. Though the business model scenario is now optional, we strongly encourage applicants to nonetheless still include this information if available in order to, on one side, demonstrate the readiness of this project design, as well as to showcase the validity of the business model behind the targeted technology. With this annex, we also get a better understanding of the reasoning behind the chosen financial mechanism or mechanisms and what is the proposed phase-out strategy that Gunnar mentioned. This annex serves to provide additional information to the outline and helps us assess the feasibility and appropriateness of the intervention in the country or sector. The problems we have witnessed in the past include that the sections were either incomplete, the inserted figures didn't have any explanation of formulas, or there were conflicting information numbers to other parts of the application documents. Simply omitting information will not score you points. As Gunnar rightfully said, we appreciate outlines in which applicants clearly point out which pieces of information are still missing or are unreliable. Missing information can be obtained or further defined during the DPP. Our advice is to be clear about what these missing pieces might be. Again, we have included here the link to a useful publication on financial mechanisms and the link to the webinar we did on financial mechanisms, and goes into more detail into what we're looking for and offers examples from our portfolio. Back to you, Gunnar.
Okay, I think this is the last slide of this section. I wanted to briefly talk about, yeah, this is the slide, sorry. I wanted to briefly talk about the Annex 6, mitigation. We've completely revised this annex. This annex is very important for us. It helps us understand the greenhouse gas mitigation potential of your project. Typical problems in the past were that there were only numbers with no explanations. That was not very helpful. We want to know the numbers, but we also want to understand them. And sometimes there were no formulas. So while a number of parameters was given, it was not clear how the calculation was performed. So therefore, like I said before, we completely revised this annex. We are giving more guidance now, and we will also ask you for more details, for example, information on where data was sourced. At the same time, we're also, since this is very important, at the same time, we're also developing an example of how to fill out this annex. We will probably publish this around the time of our next webinar. So please stay tuned for this. Okay, and I think with this, we can conclude this section and have our next Q&A section. Dalia, I think there were more questions now. Let's have some of them.
Okay, now we're going to have the last round of questions before we conclude today's webinar. So let's pick up the first question. Can we submit further annexes with additional information? Will they be taken into account during the assessment process? Maybe Radina can take it?
Yes, thank you, Dalian. The NAMA facility does not expect any additional annexes to the ones that I just covered and introduced, and cannot guarantee that any additional information will be taken into account during the assessment of the NSP outline. So focus on the mandatory annexes.
Okay. Can we replace the format of Annex 5, business model and financial mechanism, and Annex 6 with our own formats? Maybe that's for you, Gunnar?
Yeah. Well, as a rule, please provide a complete set of the application documents with all the templates that we publish on our website. If you consider your own format to be more suitable, you can use it, but please use it in addition to the templates that we developed. Yeah? But please keep the information concise or short. Okay.
Okay. The third question says, who would be better placed to submit NSP outline, a legal entity or a ministry?
I'll take that question. It's up to the submitting parties, the ministries and legal entities, to decide who would submit the NSP outline. During the assessment, the NAMA facility does not prioritize outlines that have been submitted by a ministry versus those who have been submitted by a legal entity. What is important is that the legal entity fulfills the capacity requirements and the 2 endorsement letters from the relevant national ministry in charge of climate change and the concerned national line ministry are submitted.
Okay. Can the NSP and NSO be the same entity?
Sure, and that is often the case, as I mentioned, as long as the proposed entity complies with the capacity requirements for both the applicant support partner and for the NSO. The distinction, however, between the 2 roles was introduced in order to extend the possibility of participation in our NAMA facility calls to entities that might not have the experience or capacity, that might have the experience and capacity to design the project, but not necessarily have the mandate, experience, or capacity to actually implement them. So this is why we've said that the NSO can be nominated 3 months into the DPP.
Okay. I have another question here that I'll just read and then answer myself. Is it possible to have one organization as the NSO for the technical part of the NSP and another organization as the NSO for the financial part of the NSP? Yes, this is perfectly possible, and we do have projects in our portfolio that have exactly that set up. So yes, that's possible. Just outline who will be in charge of what. Okay, and then there's some more questions here. To whom should the support letters be addressed? We'll just address them to the NAMA facility. That'll be fine. Another is the NAMA facility. Is this grant funding? Yes. There will be a grant contract. Let's see. There's a question here. Can the legal entity or NSO for implementation phase be a consortium that combines experience of various institutions? Yes, this is possible, and we do also have examples of this in our current portfolio. If you try to form a consortium, you just have to designate a lead partner in the consortium. Then, okay, somebody is asking, is it possible to share the presentation after the session? Yes, we will upload the presentation, and actually we will also upload the webinar itself, a recording of this webinar on our website. So even if you joined later and you missed parts of the explanation, you will always be able to go back and listen to our explanations.
And to build on what Gunnar just said, all the questions that have been posed here and we have not been able to answer, those will be part of the clarification notes that we will publish on our website in 2 months. And there was 2 months, in 2 weeks, as well as continuously over every 6 weeks. And there was actually another question about whether you could submit a draft or you could ask specific questions regarding the design of the project. No, we are going to clarify and answer questions that have to do with the interpretation of the general information document. So the process, the assessment of the document itself, and will not provide any specific advice such as concepts, partner structures, etc. We want to make sure this is a transparent and fair competitive call, so all the questions will be shared with the rest of the applicants on our website.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see another question here that says, it's building energy efficiency or green buildings. Is this an interesting, can this be an interesting project idea? Yes, it can be. We have three projects actually in our portfolio right now that are working on energy efficiency in buildings. And there was another question. Do you prioritize countries that have not received funds before? No, we are agnostic. The country has to be ODA eligible, and the outline has to comply with our general information document and all the other criteria that we mentioned. But there is no rule that says there can be no further projects in countries that have already received funding, or maybe in countries that do not yet have a NAMA support project are not eligible. So yeah, there's no rule like that. Okay,
so unfortunately we're running out of time right now to respond to all the questions, and as Radina have already said, we will follow up on every single question and publish them on our clarification notes. And now I hand over to you, Gwenad, for our last few minutes.
Okay. I just wanted to briefly look at what's next. We mentioned this before. We will have two webinars upcoming on the 27th of May and on the 14th of July. And we also have the clarification notes that we will be publishing the 1st of April. We've already published a clarification note that has the most frequently asked question from the last call. We'd also like to point out that on our website, you'll be able to find, like I just said, the presentation that we are showing you to you now and the recording of this webinar. We will, I'm not exactly sure when we'll do this, but sometime over the next days. And of course, you can always reach out to us at our email address, and we have a dedicated web subpage on our website on the 7th call. As a last item, please feel free to share all the information that you learned about the NAMA facility with everyone who's interested in applying and who may not have been able to participate today. And I think that's it. That's the last slide. Thank you all for participating. We hope that this was helpful for you, and we wish you a lot of success and good luck in developing your outline. And yeah, we'd like to wish you a good rest of the morning, rest of the day, or a good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you, and goodbye.
Goodbye from my side as well.